So I found myself as like in a psychiatric repetitive motion zone of writing a book also about Jewish women who left Judaism. And this book begins with the departure of a woman I'm going to introduce you to, whose name is Gessia Gelfman, who left home on the eve of her marriage. And the rest of her life followed from that runaway. So yeah, when I lay down on the couch with the psychiatrist, there's obviously something there about leaving home, the first boyfriend, was he Lutheran, all those deep personal questions. And although most people think of his history as an academic subject, if you sit down and talk to historians, they'll all tell you, what's the trauma that sent them into Catholic history or French history, or, we have our deep origin stories. Now, just to show you how relevant this is, these aren't the Jewish women, but these are a couple of the Christian Russian women who were involved in the same movement. And this is put up by Pussy Riot in Moscow. So if you wonder whether anybody cares about the past, well, there's the answer. They do in Russia. Okay, so let me begin with the assassination itself and give you some background into what's going on in Russia in 1881. So this is Alexander II, and he was actually considered to be the good Tsar because he emancipated the peasants in 1861, and lots of Jewish families and lots of other families across Russia loved the Tsar. But the radicals decided that killing the Tsar would rouse up the people into a revolution. And of course, they were tragically, tragically wrong. But what I try to do is enter into their mindset. My husband always likes to shock people by saying, my new book is about Jewish women radical terrorists, which of course raises the question of who are the terrorists of today. And of course, if you study Israeli history, you know that there were plenty of Jewish terrorists, but we don't talk about them so much today. Okay, so here is the Tsar. He was killed by a dynamite bomb. There was a big debate inside the radical circles about daggers versus guns versus these very small silver bombs. And the attack on the Tsar, this was the 6th attack. They had 5 failed attacks. Oh, his carriage will be right here at 2 o'clock on Wednesday. Nope, it's not there. And then they start over with tunneling and spies who work inside the palace, etc. Here's another image. I guess I have 2 of those. Okay, now the connection between Gessia Gelfman, the main protagonist of this story, the assassination and the pogroms is a very disturbing collection of events. And we see the same thing in 1905, and we see it many times in Eastern European history, which is Jews love the radical movement. We'll talk about why. The radical movement outrages lots of people who think they're crazy and dangerous. And the blame then comes back to the Jews. And so what happened is that the woman we're going to meet, Gessia Gelfman, her name is spread all over Russia. And the pogromists say, we need to take revenge on the Jews for what this crazy radical woman did to destroy our Tsar. Well, you can imagine how her parents feel, how the town feels, how the rest of the Jewish community feels. And so the radicals, this band of radicals, there are about 1,500 of them, about 100 Jewish women, they're battled from every side. Every side thinks they're really crazy and dangerous. And you might conclude the same, but I'll leave that up to you. So we don't have very many pictures of them because the last thing they want is some, photographic shop in 1880 or 1890 to call the police and say, oh yeah, I wonder if you're interested in this picture. So it's amazing that it not only survived, but is also on the internet. And I'm going to talk about 2 different tendencies in the left of the time, the People's Will, who Gessia Gelfman belonged to, who were the terrorists, and the propagandists. And these are the terrorists, and you can sort of see, especially this one right here behind the word impatient, because he looks very impatient. And so one of the topics of my book is the attraction of radical women to these men and how the women often stimulated the men to do terror actions. So I kind of went looking for you know, proto-feminist, pacifist women who only want to sit with the peasants and learn to read. And I came up with something exactly the opposite of what I was expecting to find. So my yellow doesn't do too well here. You can see I have a little yellow obsession. So. Oh, do you want to turn the lights down more? I guess it's a possibility. The more the movie look, does that help?
Yeah.
Okay, so these are some Russian peasants, former serfs, and the propagandists bring them little books, and the propagandists bring them medical care, and the propagandists want to sit down with these people and educate them because they're convinced that education will lead them to be radicals. But this is 1881, and it's not going too well because these serfs, ex-serfs, they don't like the radicals. They often turn them over to the police, and it's kind of a failed effort. So we get the transition here from land and liberty, right? Hand in hand, all nicey-nicey, to the people's will. The dagger, what have we got here? The dagger, the gun, and the axe, right? Let's be subtle. Okay, so this is the breakaway group that the Jewish women I'm talking about belong to. And I found this morning. I'd never seen it before, and I don't spend much time in Russia because I'm just not there very much. But this is a memorial plaque at the exact spot where this big radical organization that had 2,000 or 3,000 people split into the two wings. So the two wings were the terrorists and the propagandists. Yeah, that's really fascinating. Okay, now I want to introduce Gessia Gelfman. So I'll tell you a little bit about her. She's born in a town called Moser. It's not a shtetl. We have a lot of towns in the Pale of Settlement that are not shtetl. They are too big for shtetl, but they are still like 50% Jewish. So they're very Jewish towns, but they're not tiny villages the way we often see images of a shtetl. Her family is not poor. Her father was a wood dealer. Her mother died, and her stepmother, the evil stepmother, made a plan with her father for a shidduch, for an arranged marriage. And Gessia Gelfman says, I'm out of here. I'm not marrying a Talmudist. That's what she calls him. And I'm not going to participate in the repulsive Jewish rituals, which would be the night before your marriage. That would be the mikveh, right? So she has quite a good education for a Jewish woman. She can read and write in Russian and in Yiddish, which is very, very important. And I came across, could not believe the day that another historian found this, a letter that she published in Yiddish in a Yiddish journal in, I don't know, 1885, you know, where, no, she's already dead, 1875, sorry. Actually, we have some Israeli scholars doing research on women's writing in Yiddish, and we have found 400 Yiddish authors in this period. Okay, so the other leading terrorists often come from very noble families. This is one of the most famous one, Sofia Perovskaya. And here's her lover. And this is a great story. Movie makers out there, put this on your list. Andrei Zelyabov was the son of a serf. And she was the daughter of, I don't know, the governor of St. Petersburg. And here they are committed to revolution, you know, having sex in hiding places. And this was a love affair that really, it's not typical, but Gessia Gelfman's lover and the father of her child that dies is also a nobleman. So that ended up for me being a replication of what I had studied in the salons, Jewish women falling in love with noblemen, noblemen falling in love with Jewish women, and some couples reversed. So here she is in the dock. And here's Zelyabov in the dock. And being in the trial for a revolutionary act, a terrorist act, was a major way that the terrorists got their message out to the wider public. A couple of background pieces that you need to know. First of all, they have a huge, I mean, for that time, in the tens of thousands of the political Red Cross. They give them hiding places. They give them changes of clothing. They hire them lawyers. These people may seem really nutty radical to us, but at the time, They would be comparable to when Leonard Bernstein hosts the Black Panthers. Anyone old enough to remember that? It's like, what's her name? She ran away. She was from this rich family. She's from the Bay Area. Yeah, they're kind of Patty Hearsts in a way. They're drawn to radical politics, and some of the speeches that they would give in the dock would be distributed, and the courtrooms were flooded with well-born people, you know, that would consider this something very sympathetic, and you'll see more pictures of that. Now, when Gelfman's role in the assassination was not to throw the bomb, but was to run the safe house where the bombs were stored. And when the police raided the safe house, she's discovered, I'll introduce you in a minute to another Jewish man who was in the safe house with her, and she's pregnant. And I've worked very hard at figuring out what day the conception was, what day the trial was. In any case, she's hauled off to prison because in Russian law, you can't hang a pregnant woman. Why they were writing stipulations about that, I don't know. Introduce you to a couple of my other friends from this period. First, Mark Natanson, who was a very bookish looking guy. He went from a modernist yeshiva. His parents were Maskilim. I'll talk about that in a minute. From a modernist yeshiva to medical school, falls in love with a noble woman, and they run everything in St. Petersburg. They run the library, and they run the radical group, and they travel around the country. Then they go into exile, and they come back. And he's still around at the time of the Russian Revolution in 1917. This is Vladimir Yochelson and his wife, Dina Brodsky, and they were amazing. Yochelson also comes from a very wealthy, enlightened Jewish family. And what did he train in? I can't remember. But after his radical period, he gets sent to Siberia, and his wife gets sent to Siberia, and they become ethnographic photographers. Then he emerges from that period and comes over to run something at the Museum of Natural History. So these people, you know, they have 9 or 10 or 15 lives, which are all, you know, started in this life of being a revolutionary. Now, this is Anya Rosenstein-Kuliskoff. She was the luckiest one of all of them. First of all, she comes from a super wealthy family. Her parents had already converted. She was blonde. That might have played a role. She's in the very dangerous political underground, very dangerous. But then she comes out of it. She goes to medical school. She has a daughter. She marries an Italian socialist. She becomes a leader. Her funeral in 1926 I think it's in Milan, is attended by tens of thousands of people. And from her name, you can really learn a lot. She's born Rosenstein, but she takes the name in Russian that means peasant woman. So she has quite the life, and all through it, her daddy sends the checks every month. So there is rebellion, and there is also genteel entitlement, all going on at the same time. This is another one of my favorite guys, but I'm really mad at him a lot. His name was Lev Deutsch, also comes from a wealthy, assimilated family. And you can see from his outfit here, his revolutionary politics, because this was the peasant shirt, and it had many, many, many versions, and women wore these versions too, but it's basically, it has a thing here and then it has buttons, and he has a tumultuous life. First, he tries to pawn himself off as a peasant, but he can't because his hands are too soft and he doesn't know how to bale hay, and everybody's laughing at him. And then he's sort of a mentor to Leon Trotsky, and he's obsessed with Jews in the Revolution. He wrote about 5 books on Jews in the Revolution, even though his politics at the time of the pogroms, remember I showed you assassination, pogrom? Well, when that happened, the Jewish radicals were in total quarrels with each other. We leave the people's will and we admit that our people is suffering for our leftist politics, or we stay with the people's will and we squelch a protest against the pogrom. And that's the fight I'd love to have with Lev Deutsch. It'd probably take 2 or 3 days. I'm not sure I'd win, but that was the fight. Okay, now we have some fantastic scholarship of historians who've really dug into the records. And what I want to stress here is, first of all, that we have around between 1 and 2,000 revolutionaries who are arrested, often sent to Siberia. The wider number of supporters I already talked about. But this is the amazing thing, 95 women, Jewish women in the People's Will out of 3,000. And I looked at that statistic. 95 Jewish women, give me the names. I only have the names of 3 or 4. And this is the frustration of when you start with biographies and you try to move into social history. But the Jewish women were overrepresented. So they are 25% of all Jewish revolutionaries, and the Christian women are 15% of all, which means that the Jewish women are very welcome in these movements. And they claw their way in too, as well, because of reasons I'll explain. Okay, so we have a painter from this period, and I'm always thinking about my book cover long before the book's finished, just as a way of, imagining. So his name is Ilya Repin, and I'll show you a couple of pictures of him because he was a very famous painter at the time, extremely sympathetic to the revolutionary movement, and the red shirt. Got the red shirt? That's the propagandist. It's called The Arrest of the Propagandist. Here's all the goodies that they found when the propagandist is arrested. Now, this is a really rare picture, and it's extremely interesting. Here you see a couple, they look like they're smoking. She looks like she's giving a speech. Anybody know what this is? That's called a samovar. Yeah, that has your hot boiling Russian tea that you drink all night. They weren't so into alcohol. Here we see the older man revolutionary, right? Now, why, I've asked myself, I've been working on this book for 13 years, but who's counting? Why did they do this? Why would you leave your home? Why would you give up motherhood? Why would you give up being a wife? Why would you give up, I don't know, serenity, whatever serenity a Jew would have in the end of the 19th century to do this? You're gonna go to Siberia. You're gonna be in a jail. They were not naive about the risks, did they? Were they suicidally, self-hating, tormented? No, maybe a little. Were they idealistic? Yes, extremely idealistic. But I think what they craved was this sort of evening where the movement is the utopia of the future. Jew, Christian, I guess young, old, male, female. And it's interesting because you don't think of Russia as a home of feminism, and they were certainly not feminists in the sense we mean politically, like suffragists or something like that. But Russia's radical movements are the most welcoming of women, of all the radical movements in the 19th century. And we could talk about that. So this is another Ilya Repin that I blew up a little too large. Really too large. One of you will betray me, right? Because they're always being tortured and they're always having to give names. And that was a trauma that they anticipated, that somebody that they loved would give up their name under torture. Now, this is Vera Zazulish, who everybody used to think was the lover of Leo Deutsch until new research unveils that Leo Deutsch seems to have been gay. Yet another turn in historical scholarship. So she was also a noblewoman, and she's mad at Trepov, who's a governor, who visits a prison, and all the radicals in the prison are all gathered at the windows of the prison, and Trepov is walking in the middle of the prison yard, and he's walking, and one of the prisoners, a radical, fails to take his hat off to Trepov. And the revolutionaries in the windows are outraged when Trepov starts beating this radical for not taking his hat off. And so she decides he has to die. And it's very interesting. This is one of our first female sole terrorist actions. She wasn't Jewish. I just add that because we have to keep track. And she admitted it right after. It was not a secret terrorist act. It like Gessia Gelfman wanted theirs to be like, don't ever find us. But she said, I did this, and here's why I did this. And then the jury actually exonerated her, and crowds were cheering and screaming in the streets. She had a tremendous amount of public support. And here you see Gessia Gelfman up here. So after the assassination, the People's Will went into a descent. People did not really want to join it. It didn't dissolve, but it didn't attract so many people. And around 1895, so around 15 years after the assassination, we see this amazing emergence of political movements. Between 1897 and 1900, we have the founding conference of Russian Social Democracy, founding conference of the Bund, and founding conference, the one you might know, which would be Theodor Herzl in Basel. So let me just say a couple of words about the Bund, because the main purpose of my book is to figure out who became a terrorist, who joined the Bund, and who became a Zionist, and why did they make those decisions? That's been my working set of questions. The Bund believed in Yiddish. They didn't just speak it, but they believed in it. They believed they were militantly anti-Zionist. They did not want Jews to go to Palestine. And if you read their critiques of Palestine, you'll get some shivers, because they'll say, we don't want to dominate the Arabs. We don't want to take too much land. It reads like a Jewish Voice for Peace pamphlet if you read it. And the Zionists. And I'm going to introduce you at the end of the lecture to some of the leading Zionist women, because there's a huge debate going on in Israel about whether Zionism had a feminist component to it. Okay, so now I want to talk about why they wanted to leave. I had this funny conversation with a friend of mine, a scholar, and I was saying, I just can't figure it out. She said, Deborah, it's not so hard to figure out. The shtetl was not sexy, and it was not romantic, and they did not want to be there. So she's kind of solved it for me. The Pale of Settlement is the section of Western Russia that runs here. You can see from Lithuania all the way down to Odessa and the Black Sea. This over here is what was called Congress Poland. It's part of the Russian Empire, but in the Vienna Congress of 1815, it's given a kind of quasi-autonomy. And the place that Gessia Gelfman and many of the revolutionaries come from is the northern Pale of Settlement. So cities like Vilna and Minsk, Kovno, these are the names of the states, or the provinces. They're called gubernias. These were places that were strong in the Haskalah, militantly anti-Hasidic. The Hasidim are down here in Podolia, down in the southern part of the Pale of Settlement. So they are rational. Their parents and grandparents of the revolutionaries were text-oriented, study-oriented, Talmud-oriented, often super wealthy. And historians have tried to see how that links to the radical left being so strong in those places. And I'll talk about that in a minute. One of our best explanations for why Jewish women thrive in the radical movements is because of the business wife. The business wife, the defense of the business wife is that she has to own a shop, be a peddler. Those are two of the main. Oh, Lisa Mill, run a mill, which was a very common Jewish occupation, run a tavern. And where's her husband? He's in the yeshiva studying. So this is a very complicated, what Jewish historians call the gender role reversal. And we have a lot of ways that we track it. When we were doing our family history, we kept running into these weird names. They were like, Bat Devorah, Devorah's daughter, and they were all these Jewish family names that were in reference to a woman. And now historians are sure that that means because she's running things. She's the emotionally dominant person in the family. If you follow this all the way through to Philip Roth, which I often do, you might say that Jewish men became increasingly unhappy with these very bossy, very practical wives that they had. But it validates the idea that you know several languages, that you travel alone, that you have your own opinions, and that you're a sovereign human being. So Judaism, in a way, very traditional Judaism is kind of, you might call it ingrown feminist, without the ideology. Now, owning a tavern and making whiskey were very, very important occupations. There's an estimate that something like 60% of the Jewish homes in the Pale of Settlement had a tavern in the house. Okay, so this is very frequent, and it led to a lot of anti-Semitism because of him. Here he is, right? Where is he? Come on, guy. Here, right here. Okay. And this is not very pretty. And this is not, well, this is somebody who's on his way to the state, right? So the Jews themselves don't drink very often, very low rates of alcoholism, but they're selling alcohol to people who don't have much money. So it's not a pleasant situation. Now, for years, I've loved this picture. Partly I love it because of her bare feet, right? But I also, for a long time, I thought this was a cigarette and then, or a cigar. And I thought, no, there's no Jewish woman smoking a cigar in a tavern. And one of my students convinced me it was a spoon. But, but yeah, so here you see, you know, the Jewish family, and this is a pretty emancipated Jewish family because he has a short beard and she doesn't have all her hair covered. And we can learn a lot from these images. Okay, now, when the business wife role, the business wife role often became extended to the daughters. And if you read any memoirs of the Lower East Side, if you read these wonderful novels by, her name will come to me in the middle of the night, they're all about that the fathers and the mothers send the daughters out to work. And what we see in the Pale of Settlement is this massive urbanization. So by 1910, 1915, we have huge, I mean, they're not huge cities, Pinsk and Minsk, and Mogilev. They have large numbers of Jewish women, teenagers, working in factories owned by other Jews, because everybody's keeping Shabbat, so you need to work for another Jew, but the parents let them go. And the parents cannot keep track of them. And once they're in this situation, they can have sex, they earn money, and they become mainly Bundist revolutionaries. And it's a tragedy. Well, you'll see all the tragedies. The tragedies are mounting. I'll be giving you many tragedies. So here, how the Jewish daughters were pawns in the family marriage system. This is the Shad Khan over here. Look at them, right? Just look at that look. It's like, I don't know, how would you describe it? Conniving, the power behind the scenes. Here are some of the women that they're evaluating. So in a system where the men cannot achieve upward mobility through going to the university, it was very difficult to do for Jews, unlike in Germany or France or England or the United States, where the Jewish men, you know that very well. You go from a pawnbroker, then you have a push cart, then you have, in my family, we've got exactly these stories, I'm sure you do too. Then you have the dry goods store, then the son becomes an accountant, and then we're off to the Nobel Prizes, and this is the Jewish way. But it's the Jewish way for men, and it was done on the backs of women, who were then forced into these arranged marriages by the shadchanim because the family's honor and the family's finances were it was all so close to the bone, right? So if your son cannot provide as a doctor, your daughter has to marry a rich man. Yeah, you remember that from Fiddler on the Roof, right? But there weren't that many rich men to go around, and there were a lot of older, I hope the men are not getting upset here. Nobody's left the room yet. There were a lot of unattractive men that really needed a wife fast, because the Jewish families were huge. If you have 10 children and you're a widower, you're not hiring a nanny, you need a wife. So I just did that one. Okay, now I'll talk a little bit about the maskilim. My favorite maskil here is Moses Mendelssohn, and I can't identify them all, so please don't give me the test after class. Okay, now I spent years on the maskilim and women, because the maskilim favored learning secular languages, getting a good education, having the men having non-Jewish, non-Talmudic, non-yeshiva jobs, and supporting the family. And they hated the business wives because the business wives were embarrassing. In high society, you don't have a woman who's out in the market hawking her, her eggs or something like that. So, and the Israeli scholarship on this is wonderful, wonderful what's coming out. So eventually, after 14 years of fidgeting with this, I came to the conclusion that the maskilim did help women. They published romantic novels in Yiddish that made fun of arranged marriages. They established many, many elementary schools for Jewish women. The one thing they couldn't tackle was the commercial wedding system. They couldn't tackle that. It was too big. You're a Maskilic intellectual. You sit in a room and write books. Maybe you teach classes, but you don't go to parents and tell them let their daughter marry whoever she wants. That's not the zone that they were operating in. If you were, I think Lauren maybe might remember this picture. It's kind of a haunting picture. I dream about this picture because we don't have a lot of pictures of Jewish prostitutes, especially we don't have a lot of pictures of them naked, where the men are haggling over their price. Now, the era of Jewish prostitution at its peak is after this radical movement, but I want to make it clear that this is the evolution of the Jewish family system. Many children, many daughters, a very nasty dowry system that no one seems to have gotten rid of, resulting in this huge overflow of Jewish women who are not allowed to study. If they're working in a cigarette factory. Would you rather be a trafficked woman in Buenos Aires, or would you rather be working in a cigarette factory and then marry a man that you hate? I mean, the fathers kind of sold them off. They had these markets that were on the border of Germany and Russia, and Germany and Poland. And then there's this wink and a nod marriage where the pimps pretend to marry them. And the reason that the Jewish prostitution situation changed was because of the very brave women in Buenos Aires who spoke out at tremendous risk. I had a fantasy of writing a book on Jewish prostitution, but I just don't know that I don't know if I can bear it. Okay, so we have great research about changing ages of marriage, changing amounts of divorce that help us put the radical women in context. Now, this won't come as a surprise to you, but the consequences may come as a surprise to you. So the girls in the yeshiva system, the cheder system, and no water on electronics, please. A couple years ago, a tech guy in the department who was working on my computer, 5 minutes before class, he spilled a whole cup of hot tea on my laptop. And as a kind person, I did not want to upset him. Luckily, I had saved it onto the website. But these things happen. Yeah, should I end? Time to end?
Just in case.
Oh, just in case we get a rain shower. Thank you. Okay. So we know a lot about how you go from yeshiva to the barricades. We have hundreds of documented boys who make that route, but the girls don't go that route because they don't have that education to resist. So the way they get to the root, the way they get to the radical movement is much more, it's kind of like they're scratching a hole in the dirt to find a way to become educated. One girl knows how to speak Russian, so she starts a little study group, or they become seamstresses. They have these really intricate pathways towards leaving. That's a medieval example. Leaving the home, leaving traditional Judaism. Now, you might ask yourself, and I have a number of colleagues in the field who romanticize and sentimentalize her, right? By saying the Judaism is a domestic religion and we don't care if there's a mechitza in the shul, and we don't care about all these other things. You can't read from the Torah, you can't sing, you can't do anything. None of that matters, because all that matters is that the home is a Jewish women's space. And so there's a lot of wonderful stuff about that, but I don't buy it because the women that I'm studying, they're not going to stay there. And in the end of the talk, I'm going to suggest some of the implications of that. Okay, so now I'm going to move forward into the legacies. And I've chosen for you just two women, two of my super, super favorites. Anyone heard of Rosa Luxemburg before? She's famous. She has some name recognition. So she's an amazing example. She's born in Poland. She comes from a very educated family. They send her to Switzerland. She gets a PhD in political economy. She writes a book which is still being used in the Polish school system on the history of capitalism in Poland. These people were endlessly sectarian. So it's not enough to be a Polish revolutionary. She and her lover, Leo Jogisz, become Polish revolutionaries living in Germany who don't support Polish independence because they think Russian integration is better for modernization. I mean, so sectarian. Okay, now this is her lover. And here you see him at his most innocent. And here you see him shortly before his death at the hands of the proto-fascist Freikorps thugs who killed Rosa Luxemburg in 1919. And I want to stress, well, first, you can see life has hardened him, right? He's very hardened. He learned Yiddish. He came from a very wealthy family in Vilna, and his family was so famous that they bought the shul, the major synagogue for Vilna, the Yogish's shul, but he decides to become a locksmith instead of, what they would have wanted for him. And he's speaking Polish. He's living in Vilna, which is not speaking Lithuanian then, is speaking Polish, and he learns Yiddish so he can organize the Jewish workers, which is just absolutely astonishing. It shows that we're not going from primitive, non-assimilated Jews into the revolutionary movement. We're looking at assimilated Jews who are disassimilating in order to become Bundists, which is why the Bund was such a powerful movement. Okay, this is, I guess I have 4 women. This is Esther Frumkin. We don't have many pictures of her. She also has many other names. She's also called Malka Lifshitz. She goes through many names. She's married to a Bundist who dies young. She is different than Luxemburg never had a child, although she yearned for one. Gessia Gelfand's child dies in prison. And most of my women revolutionaries have what I call cases of tragic motherhood, but not Frumkin. Frumkin has her own daughter. She raises her 2 daughters from her sister, her 2 nieces, and she also raises the daughter of her midwife. So she's a single woman writing treatises, teaching at the University of Minsk, very active in the Yiddish movement and in the Bund. She's the leading woman in the Bund. And she, in her world, finds space for motherhood, which is, I find extremely notable. Okay, here's my last woman, Amanya Vilbashevitz Shochat. She came from a huge family that was divided between the Haskalah and Hasidism. So every night they would have those fights. 10 kids in the family, 3 suicides, 4 made Aliyah. One of her brothers is the founder of the Shemen Oil Works, and her other brother, Gedalia, is a major engineer. They play a huge role in the Yishuv, the Jewish settlement of Palestine. And she's the sort of founder of the kibbutz. And I won't go into all the details. I'd be happy to do it in the question period. And the quote here from one of her comrades is, "A new Jewish family for a new Jewish society." And I will be arguing in my book that, that this is an achievement, the founding of the kibbutzim, an achievement for Jewish women that is overwhelming, even though it has many wrinkles and you might say failures. Okay, conclusions. You know who this is? Does she look familiar? She's my mother's heroine, Henrietta Zold. And I'll tell you a funny little story. When I was 13 or 14, it was 1960, St. Paul, Minnesota. There was a contest to write the best essay on Henrietta Zold. And my mother said, "Debbie, you can do this." Okay, so she hands me a biography. I sit in my room, I write an essay. And only 2 people entered the contest. And guess who didn't win? And I found it in my files. And it was so funny. My brothers and my mother, my mother's 98, we just had such a laugh over this funny little essay. One of the sentences in there. "And I too hope to become a notable Jewish woman and find God in my own way." Okay, so that was interesting. Okay, and if you've heard of the Triangle Shirtwaist fire, this is in a way the greatest Bundist success in New York City because it has all the ingredients. It has young Jewish women trapped working in factories, furious at their parents, furious at their brothers, not paid decent wages with Jewish bosses, right? And so that I would say, if we talk about the long-term legacy of radical Jewish women, I would say Hadassah, founded by Henrietta Zold. I'm a proud lifetime member. And and the labor unions, which came out of all this Jewish women's organizing. And I was going to put synagogue sisterhoods on there, but I wasn't so sure about that. Okay, now, you know what this is, right? Yeah, Women of the Wall. I'm sure, has everyone heard of the Women in the Wall? Okay, so that's a kind of interesting thing to have these cross-generational debates with. So if I'm in a room with Rosa Luxemburg and Gessia Gelfman and I show them this picture, well, they're not going to understand, you know, why are you trying to save Judaism? Why don't you just walk away? It's a patriarchal religion and look what it did to me. But I would say back to them, this is solving the problem that helped make you a radical in the first place. And I'm sure we can talk a lot about that. You know, every time I've lived in Israel, I've been amazed at the separation between the feminists at the wall and, you know, like the women who are in Meretz or, you know, in the left-wing parties, because it's a quite interesting distinction. Okay, this is my last slide. You know who painted this, right? Marc Chagall. So this is the way I'd like to conclude. I think when we put Chagall up on our wall, or we listen, or we watch Fiddler on the Roof, because our lives are so barren of the richness of Jewish life, we can get a little sentimental. And there's nothing really wrong with that. I just went to hear at the new Yiddish Land office on next to the post office in La Jolla. I went to hear Yael Strom and Elizabeth Schwartz, and I'm singing along to the songs, and I'm perfectly sentimental. But I think what's happened in this neo-sentimental attitude towards traditional Judaism is that the real suffering of Jewish women has been squelched, ignored. And I think if we're really to own our tradition and really live in it, and not just put it up on the wall, but integrate it into how we see Judaism going forward, I think we need to know the truth about how poorly Jewish women were treated. And with that, I'll end. Thank you.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you so much, Deborah. That was wonderful. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, beautiful. I want to say, first of all, that this is actually our very first Mandelbaum lecture that we are live streaming. So that is an exciting moment. So to anybody who is watching at home or anywhere from Zoom, thank you so much for your patience with the technical issues. And we're learning and we'll get better every time with it, but we just want to say thank you. And it's a really exciting moment that we are able to offer this both here in person and virtually for people who aren't yet comfortable to join us again in person. So we just want to say thank you to everybody who's coming, no matter how you're joining us today. I also just want to make a couple announcements before we do open it up to questions. First of all, our next lecture is going to be here again December 8th with Ronit Weiss-Berkowitz. She is a visiting professor with the Murray Gallinson San Diego Israel Initiative, and she will be speaking on Israeli cinema. She is an Israeli filmmaker, and we'll be talking about the differences between American and Israeli cinema. So that'll be a wonderful lecture. We'll send out more information after this one. Also, I wanted to mention that some, if not all of you, may have received our appeal for our underwriter campaign for our Mandelbaum Lecture Series. And if you are in a position to do so, we ask that you donate. Any amount is much appreciated, and it allows us to bring fantastic speakers like Deborah to the community. So again, if you're in a position, that would be wonderful. But if you have any questions, I am more than happy to answer. So now we are going to open it up for questions. So I will let Deborah come back over. And if you have any questions, please feel free to raise your hand.
Just like the classroom. Yes.
What was the people's will for?
Ah, yes. Okay, brilliant question. Thank you. So this is what's fascinating. Originally, you would think coming into this that they were all radical socialists, but in fact, they weren't. You had some major figures in the people's will who were liberal constitutionalists. Now, all these people, they study the French Revolution, and they would, you could have a conversation with them, which would say, okay, do you support Robespierre? Do you support the Jacobins? Did you support the king being beheaded? So some of them were just really mad liberals who there was no home for them. There was no liberal party. There was no party that was saying, let's have a constitution and keep the czar, which in fact they sort of do in 1905. So that's what's fascinating, is that the socialism and anarchism is not articulated yet. So sometimes anarchism is not a word that's used in the 1880s. They're called Bakuninists because they follow Mikhail Bakunin. So I would say my guess would be, if you had a conversation with them in our language, do you want to, socialize the means of production? Do you want to do what Lenin wanted, the Bolsheviks wanted? Many of them would say, yes, we want to end the aristocracy and the nobility, cut the head off the czar, end czarism, and sort of jump to 1917 in a way. But you get a lot of them who would be very happy with the liberal solution of the Duma that was created in 1905. But they're all smashed together in this one group because the political spectrum is frozen in Russia, unlike in England or Germany or France, where every one of those political positions by 1880 has its own party, its own newspapers, its own strategies, etc. Yes, my friend Hannah, who's brought me here in the first place. Thank you, Hannah, for everything.
I was wondering two things. Where do the pogroms come in to the picture regarding these radicalists? Are they part of the cause? And the second question is the imagery of the hook noses in that one particular one at the tavern.
Yeah.
It's just a sign to me of anti-Semitism.
Oh,
And
there's,
Deborah, can
yeah.
you repeat the questions? just so
Yes,
our Zoom
sure.
audience will hear?
Hi, Zoom people. Hi, distant learners. We're here for you. The question Hannah asked, the first question is about how the pogroms fit into the bigger picture. And the second question is the anti-Semitic tavern satire, you might say. What's its significance? So the first question is that the Jewish radicals are in a very hard place about the pogroms, because this pogrom that I depicted here started in April. They almost always start Easter, Passover. There's just this deep historic religious link there. The radical movement writes a pamphlet in the summer of 1881 saying the pogroms are the first step to social revolution. First they'll rob the Jews, and then when they're done with robbing the Jews, they'll turn on the landlords and they'll end serfdom. Again, back to the French Revolution. It's the summer of 1789. They'll go into the manor house and tear up the feudal contracts. And Deutsch and Pavel Axelrod, I think they're up every night debating what they should do. I already mentioned this. So some Jewish radicals say, no, we're not going to be in with the secular radical movement anymore. And that's when the Bund is born. But it's still just born in somebody's head. It's not until 1897 or 1893 that you get Jews who they have all the radical politics in them, but they are not going to betray their families and their hometowns. And they finally realize, this is so fascinating. The slogan of the radicals was back to the people, aid the people, help to the people, the Narod. And the Jewish radicals who part off and become either Zionists or Bundists say, guess what? The Jews are people too. The Jews are our people and we need to aid them. But keep in mind that Trotsky, Rosa Luxemburg, all the big brains of Russian socialism think the Jews are not a class, or they're not part of the working class. They're a pariah group outside the class structure, which has to be eliminated because they represent petty trade, because they're not in the Marxist system of the big factory and the union, etc. So it's the whole thing is extremely troubling about being a radical and what to do with the pogroms, because the pogroms were a punishment to the Jewish community for these radicals, and everybody knew that. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't find pogroms where there's no radicals. There's plenty of pogroms to go around. So a Russian historian who's working with the documents might actually disagree with me and say that the 1881 pogrom or the 1905 pogroms were not stimulated by radicals. That's debatable.
Did this part lead us to the larger emigration in the?
Oh my God, yes. Oh, yes. I mean, we have huge, amazing scholarship on that. So pogroms scare the Jews. Jews come to the United States. The doors are open. All of our ancestors came in probably in the period between 1880 and when the doors shut in 1922 with the Johnson Act. But history is surprising. They're not emigrating from the areas where the pogroms were. It's yet another wrinkle on how does history actually work. Most of the immigrants are coming from southern Russia, where there aren't so many radicals, and it's not clear that conditions are worse for them. So what we found when we did our family history, that the total schlemiels, I don't want to insult any of your relatives, but the total schlemiels do not go because they don't have the oomph. That's why they're schlemiels. But the next layer, which are the sort of somewhat functional relatives who are not doing so well, get put on the boat. And that's my family's history, and we documented it exactly when we went to Latvia. And that corresponds exactly with what we know about the history of immigration. It is not the poorest, it is not the well-to-do. It is, you know, those people, of which there were millions. Yes.
Well, first of all, thank you for a delightful lecture. Question, where do you place Gold to my ear in terms of this paradigm? As you were talking, her name kept ringing.
Oh,
in my
yeah.
mind.
Oh, she's so great. And there's a new biopic of her. Oh, there's a new biopic of Golda Meir, and I loved her memoir. So she comes out of an Eastern European family. They come to Milwaukee when she's a girl. She joins Paul Etzion. Paul Etzion is my favorite political organization. When I am reborn, I guess your soul is going to be reborn forward, not backwards. Right? But as a historian, I would give anything to be in Paul Etzion, the Workers of Zion. So she's in the furthest left Zionist party. She gets to Palestine in 21. My book ends in 1914, so she's in the epilogue section. Moves to a kibbutz, has 2 children, and she starts moving her way up through the women's organization of the Labor Party, which is called Na'amat. They run daycare centers, and there's Ort. I'm not familiar with all the women's organizations, but they're basically Zionist women's organizations in Mandate Palestine. And then she kicks the women out from under her and goes up into the Labor Party as, you know, this wonderful bully woman that we adore. But she doesn't do it with other women. And so she's a troubling figure. She's a heroine. She certainly shows how far women could come in labor Zionism. But there's some shadows and problems in her story. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm going to ask a different question, but I was recently told that Americans think of Golda Meir as like really fabulous, wonderful, but not in Israel. They don't think she's so great. But that's not my main.
Oh, good, because I don't know what to say.
My grandfather came from somewhere on that map, and he lived in an apartment house in the Bronx that was built by the.
Oh yeah. Oh, that's a very famous place.
And
The worker. It's called the Workers Cooperative.
The Workman's Circle.
The Workman's
and
Circle,
Sophie lived there. She was little when they came, but my grandfather, I think he came around 1900. This building was built by the Bund. So how did the Bund over there come over here and help these people here?
Yeah. Well,
Deborah, what's the question?
oh, what's the question? The Workman's Circle in New York City, the co-ops, I think they were also called in the Bronx. Okay, how do we get from here to there? Very simple. The model of the Bund was we create Jewish community where we are. We don't get on boats, but a lot of them actually had gotten on the boat, but the boat took them to New York. A lot of Israelis you meet come from Bundes families. There's a lot of ex-Bundes in the closet in Israel. So when they come to New York, their major figure, and you can read, it's all, I'm sure, digitized. It's Abe Kahn. Abraham Kahn was the editor of the Forwards, which has a huge building. You can go step outside. I don't know what it is today, but it's on the Lower East Side. And Kahn, he's a great figure in my book because I started learning Yiddish so I could read his memoir, and then I decided I couldn't manage it. I wasn't going to do it because a lot of it is in English. He is joining the People's Will in 1881 in a suburb of a shtetl near Vilna. And his mother says to him, "They're coming for you. Get on the boat." So these mothers, they say, "Go." And he gets on the boat. And while he's on the boat, he spends the entire time on the boat having a debate with a group that my father would have adored called Am Olam. Am Olam wanted to build rural kibbutzim in the United States. And they chose places that my father would have loved. North Dakota. and in Vineland, New Jersey, those are also Bundes making eggs, getting ready to make, some of them to make Aliyah. And so they believe in, they believe in like the JCC, workers' housing, the unions. They're not about praying. They think, and they're not about rich Jews who own factories who lock Jewish women in to burn to death. They are about joining the social movements and helping Jews in their daily life. And when I finished my career as a Politzionik, I would love to be born in one of those places. And you know, the architect who designed the Holocaust Museum in Berlin, remind me his name, he grew up in those. Yeah, that would be an honor. I don't know if they're still there. They are still there?
The buildings in the Bronx, you talk about Workwood Circle and Van Cortlandt Park South, and the Bronx was 38% farms when they built these 6-story apartment houses. Well, the ones in Van Cortlandt Park are 12 stories, but yeah.
Yeah, that's total Bundes.
It sounds wonderful.
Yeah, I met a scholar from Warsaw at a conference once, and the topic we were discussing was the Bund, because he's an expert on Rosa Luxemburg. So I said, you know, why wasn't Rosa Luxemburg Bundes? And then we're going on and on and on. And I said to him, you know, I wish I could have been a Bundes. He said, Deborah, don't you realize the JCC is the Bund? So I guess they're fitting in here. Is that, we have to stop, right?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.